A single man stopped the most powerful empire on Earth with tactics so brutal that 500 years later, Hollywood turned him into the ultimate monster. But here's what they never tell you. Everything he did was to save his people from complete destruction. And the method he used to break an entire army's spirit involved just one horrifying discovery that still haunts historians today. Today we're diving into the true story of Vlad the Impaler, the real man behind Dracula. Most people think they know this guy, vampire, Transylvania, scary castle. But the actual story is way more intense than any movie. We're talking about a ruler who faced down an empire that controlled half the known world, using methods so extreme they're still talked about today. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why historians argue he might have saved all of Europe. But first, I need to tell you about the moment when even I had to put down the historical documents because what I was reading was too disturbing to process. Let's set the scene. It's the 1400s, and the Ottoman Empire is basically unstoppable. Imagine a massive python slowly coiling around Europe. That's exactly what the Ottoman expansion looked like on a map. They controlled everything from Turkey to the borders of Austria, from the Black Sea down to North Africa. They were the superpower of their time, with the best military technology, endless resources, and a track record of conquering everyone who stood in their way. And right in their path was a tiny region called Wallachia, which is part of modern-day Romania. Wallachia was maybe 1/10 the size of the Ottoman Empire. They had no major allies, limited resources, and were surrounded by enemies. It would be like Luxembourg trying to fight the entire United States military, completely hopeless. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's something most history books skip over. The Ottomans had a system for dealing with small kingdoms that was actually more terrifying than outright conquest. They would demand tribute, basically protection money, but the real kicker was what they called the blood tax. Every few years, they'd send collectors through Christian territories to take the strongest, smartest boys between ages 8 and 18. These children would never see their families again. These boys were taken to Constantinople, converted to Islam, and trained to become janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers who were basically programmed to be completely loyal to the Sultan. Can you imagine being a parent in Wallachia, knowing that any day soldiers might show up and just take your son forever? This wasn't happening to a few families, this was systematic across the entire region. Wallachia had been paying this blood tax for years. The previous rulers bent the knee, sent their gold, watched their children disappear, and slowly turned their kingdom into a puppet state. The people were being taxed into poverty to pay the Ottomans. An entire generation of young men was being stolen and turned into weapons against their own homeland. Then in 1456, a new ruler took power in Wallachia. His name was Vlad Dracula, literally meaning Vlad the Dragon after his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon. But he would soon be known by a different name entirely, and what he was about to do would either save his people or damn them all forever. But before we get to that, you need to understand the twisted education that prepared him for what was coming. Here's something that shocked me when I first researched this story. Vlad had actually grown up as a hostage in the Ottoman court. When he was just 11 years old, barely older than a 5th grader, his father had handed him and his brother over to Sultan Murad II as part of a tribute agreement. This wasn't uncommon. It was how the Ottomans ensured loyalty. Take the ruler's sons, raise them in Ottoman culture, and eventually they'd be loyal to the empire. But something went horribly wrong with Vlad. Instead of becoming loyal to their captors, he spent 6 years studying everything about them like a prisoner planning the perfect escape. He learned their language, their military tactics, their political system, their weaknesses. He watched how they operated, how they thought, how they conquered, and most importantly, he learned exactly what they feared most. During his time in the Ottoman court, Vlad witnessed something that would shape his entire approach to warfare. The Ottomans had a psychological warfare strategy that was incredibly effective. When they conquered a city, they wouldn't just take it, they'd make an example of it. They'd do things so brutal and shocking that the next city would surrender without a fight just to avoid the same fate. They'd pile up skulls outside city walls, impale local leaders, and leave displays that would haunt people's nightmares for generations. Vlad realized something crucial. If psychological warfare worked for the Ottomans, it could work against them too. But he'd have to take it to a level that would shock even them. And honestly, as I was reading about his methods, there were moments where I had to step away from my research because the historical accounts were so disturbing to process. This is a man who turned brutality into an art form, and the question that haunted me was, when does necessary defense become something monstrous? When he finally returned to Wallachia and claimed his throne, Vlad faced an immediate test. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the same guy who had just conquered Constantinople and basically ended the Byzantine Empire, sent ambassadors demanding the usual tribute. But these weren't just any ambassadors. They came with turbans on their heads, and according to Ottoman custom, they refused to remove them in the presence of foreign rulers. Here's where Vlad did something that still gives me chills. Most kings would have just ignored this slight. Vlad saw it as the perfect opportunity to send a message that would echo across two empires. He had the ambassadors' turbans nailed to their heads with small iron nails, then sent them back to the Sultan with a note basically saying, "Next time, show some respect." Can you imagine the horror of those men traveling days back to Constantinople with metal literally hammered into their skulls? This was Vlad's declaration of war against the most powerful empire in the world, and he was just getting started. But what happened next would test every moral boundary you can imagine, and it raises a question that historians still debate today. How far is too far when your people's survival is at stake? The Sultan's response was predictable. He sent an army to crush this upstart prince, but Vlad had spent years preparing for this moment, and what he did next changed the entire psychology of warfare in medieval Europe. First, he scorched his own earth like a man burning down his own house to spite his enemies. As the Ottoman army advanced into Wallachia, they found nothing but burned villages, poisoned wells, and empty fields. Vlad had evacuated his people and destroyed everything that could help the invading army. The Ottomans, who were used to living off conquered lands during campaigns, suddenly found themselves in a wasteland with no supplies. But the real psychological warfare was just beginning, and here is where I need to share something that still haunts me about this research. As the Ottoman army pushed deeper into Wallachia, they started finding bodies. Lots of bodies. Ottoman soldiers who had been captured weren't just killed, they were impaled on wooden stakes and left as warnings. We're talking about thousands of people, displayed in ways designed to strike terror into anyone who saw them. Now, impalement wasn't something Vlad invented. It was actually an Ottoman punishment that he had witnessed during his time as their hostage. But Vlad perfected it into something way more systematic and terrifying. Here's the part that made me understand the true horror of what he was doing. He understood that the goal wasn't just to kill enemies. It was to break their will to fight by making death look like mercy compared to capture. The stakes were arranged in geometric patterns that could be seen from miles away, like some nightmare version of a crop circle. They were placed along roads, around cities, near rivers, anywhere the advancing Ottoman army would encounter them. And they weren't just random displays of violence. Each arrangement was carefully designed to send specific messages. When Ottoman messengers were captured, Vlad would have them impaled in ways that told a story. If they had been demanding tribute, they'd be impaled near treasure boxes filled with rotting food. If they had been recruiting children for the Janissary Corps, they'd be surrounded by stakes holding the bodies of Ottoman recruiters. Every display was a direct response to Ottoman policies that had terrorized his people for decades. Then came the moment that changed everything. Vlad's masterstroke that broke the psychological backbone of the Ottoman war machine. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II himself decided to lead an army into Wallachia to personally deal with this troublesome prince. This was the same sultan who had conquered Constantinople, who had never lost a major battle, who commanded an army of over 100,000 men. He was coming to crush this rebellion once and for all. As Mehmed's forces approached Targoviste, Wallachia's capital, they crested a hill and saw something that stopped the entire army in its tracks. Spread out in the valley below was what historians call the Forest of the Impaled. Over 20,000 stakes arranged in perfect rows like a nightmare orchard, each holding the body of an Ottoman soldier or collaborator. Picture this, an army of hardened warriors, men who had seen the worst of medieval warfare, suddenly going completely silent. The sight was so shocking that Sultan Mehmed II, a man who had personally led dozens of brutal military campaigns, reportedly turned pale and had to retreat to his tent. Some Ottoman chroniclers wrote that soldiers in the army began praying and crying at the sight. This was an army that had conquered half of Europe, and they were psychologically broken by what one man had done to their comrades. The smell alone was reported to be detectable from over a mile away. Birds wouldn't even fly over the area. And right in the center of this forest of death, on the tallest stake, was the body of the Ottoman general who had been leading the advance guard. But here's what's really important to understand, and here's where my own moral compass started spinning. This wasn't random cruelty. Every single person on those stakes had been identified as either an Ottoman invader or a Wallachian collaborator who had helped with the blood tax, taking children from their families. Vlad had spent months conducting what we'd now call intelligence operations, identifying everyone who had been working with the Ottomans against his people. The Forest of the Impaled was his response to decades of Ottoman occupation and cultural destruction. But looking at the historical accounts, I found myself asking, does the righteousness of the cause justify methods that would make modern war crimes tribunals recoil in horror? The psychological warfare worked exactly as Vlad had planned. Sultan Mehmed II, who had never retreated from a battle, ordered his entire army to withdraw from Wallachia. The most powerful military force in the world had been defeated not by superior numbers or better weapons, but by one man's understanding of fear. But Vlad wasn't finished yet. What he did next was so audacious that it almost ended the Ottoman Empire entirely. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad took a small force of just 10,000 men and launched what became known as the Night Attack of Targoviste, one of the most audacious military operations in history. His plan was to assassinate Sultan Mehmed II himself and end the war in a single night. The attack was perfectly planned. Vlad's men, who knew the local terrain like the back of their hands, infiltrated the massive Ottoman camp in complete darkness. They had studied the camp layout for days and knew exactly where the Sultan's tent was located. For several hours, chaos reigned in the Ottoman camp. Vlad's forces moved like ghosts, striking at command tents, supply wagons, and sleeping soldiers before vanishing back into the darkness. Vlad himself led the charge toward the Sultan's tent, and here's the moment that gives me chills every time I think about it. According to Ottoman records, he came within minutes of reaching Mehmed II personally. Can you imagine if he had succeeded? The entire course of European history would have changed. The Ottoman Empire might have collapsed into civil war, the conquest of Europe would have stopped, and Vlad would have gone down as the man who single-handedly saved Christianity. But at the last moment, fate intervened. Either through luck or better intelligence than expected, the Sultan had moved his tent to a different location. Vlad's forces fought their way to where the Sultan should have been, only to find the tent empty. As dawn broke, Vlad realized he had pushed his luck as far as it could go and ordered a retreat. The night attack didn't achieve its ultimate goal, but it accomplished something almost as important. It proved that the Ottoman Empire could be hurt, that their armies could be defeated, that the seemingly unstoppable force of Ottoman expansion could be stopped by the right tactics and enough determination. Word of this victory spread throughout Europe like wildfire, inspiring resistance movements across the Balkans. But what happened to Vlad after this triumph would prove that sometimes winning the war isn't enough to save you from your own people. So what happened to the man who stopped an empire? Well, that's where the story gets heartbreakingly complicated, and it's a lesson that still applies to leadership today. His extreme methods, which had saved Wallachia from Ottoman conquest, also made him enemies among his own people and neighboring kingdoms. Some Wallachian nobles, who had been profiting from collaboration with the Ottomans, saw Vlad as a threat to their wealth and power. They preferred the predictable corruption of Ottoman rule to the unpredictable violence of a ruler who actually fought for his people. In 1462, the same year as his greatest victory, Vlad was betrayed by his own allies and imprisoned by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus. He spent over a decade in captivity while Wallachia fell back under Ottoman influence. Can you imagine the frustration? He had beaten the unbeatable enemy, only to be destroyed by the very people he had saved. When he was finally released and briefly returned to power in 1476, Vlad was killed in battle against the Ottomans. But by then, his work was done. The Ottoman advance into Europe was permanently slowed. Other leaders had learned from his tactics. The psychological warfare he pioneered became a model for resistance movements throughout the Ottoman Empire. Here's the tragic irony that keeps me up at night sometimes when I think about this story. Vlad's brutal methods, which were designed to save his people from an even more brutal fate under Ottoman rule, eventually became the foundation for one of the most famous monster stories in history. Bram Stoker took the name Dracula and the reputation for cruelty and turned it into a vampire story that had almost nothing to do with the real man. But the real Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, wasn't a supernatural monster. He was something far more complex and historically significant. He was a man who faced impossible odds and found a way to win, using tactics so extreme that they're still debated by historians today. He was a leader who understood that sometimes, when facing total annihilation, conventional morality becomes a luxury you can't afford. Some argue he was a hero who saved Europe from Ottoman conquest. Others say he was a war criminal whose methods were unjustifiable regardless of the circumstances. But what everyone agrees on is this: he was one of the most effective military strategists in history, a man who proved that even the most powerful empires have weaknesses that can be exploited by someone smart enough and determined enough to find them. The Ottoman Empire continued to exist for another 400 years after Vlad's death, but their expansion into Europe effectively ended with his resistance. The psychological warfare tactics he developed influenced military thinking for centuries, and the story of how one man with limited resources defeated the world's greatest superpower became a legend that still inspires people today. Whether you see him as a hero or a villain, Vlad the Impaler changed the course of world history. He proved that sometimes, when facing total annihilation, conventional morality becomes a luxury you can't afford. He showed that the right person with the right strategy can defeat enemies that seem impossibly powerful. And perhaps most importantly, he demonstrated that the price of victory might be your own soul, a lesson that leaders and nations still grapple with today. That's the real story behind Dracula, not a vampire count in a castle, but a military genius who used psychological warfare to stop an empire and save a continent, only to discover that sometimes the methods you use to defeat monsters can turn you into one. If these untold stories that shaped our world fascinate you as much as they do me, subscribe for more.